Well, welcome to the fourth talk of this retreat in Aidan and Hilda week on the holy island of Lindisfarne, with a fascinating group from many countries. Today we talk about Saint Hilda, or Mother Hilda, as she was widely known. When the English nation was being formed, when the people's gods lost their shine, and the true God began to loom large, when its church was like a chrysalis emerging from its Irish womb, but did not yet know how to fly, God placed a shining woman on a throne not made by man, at the centre of two worlds no one else could span. Her name was Hilda. I have written a book called Hilda of Whitby, and although Bede, being a mere man, has only one paragraph about her, we know quite a lot more from other sources and putting two and two together. After Hilda's death and the destruction of the double monasteries by the Vikings in England, France and Germany, there was no woman for 1,000 years who led both women and men in the Christian church. And therefore it is very important for us to understand how God used this remarkable woman in so many diverse ways. We've talked about Aidan. He came from Iona to this place in 635. 21 years before that, further south, outside this kingdom of Northumbria, Hilda was born. Her uncle Edwin was the pagan king of the southern part of Northumbria, Deira, with its headquarters at York. But he had to flee, as did his relatives, including Hilda's father. They tried to flee to a tiny little Celtic kingdom that had still remained perched between the two big Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. It was a little place called Elmet, which is today's Leeds. Is that why my Berwick vicar keeps asking us to pray for Leeds at the beginning of a church service? It had something special, but it wasn't long to last as a remaining Celtic kingdom. But Hilda's mother, Breguswyth, knew that her husband had fled to save his life, and she found she was pregnant, and she went searching for her husband, but she never found him because he was killed. Distraught and in tears, she had a dream, and in the dream she searched inside the folds of her cloak and found a jewel. The jewel was so bright that it lit up all the kingdoms of the Saxons and of the Picts and of the Celts. All the peoples of the British Isles were lit up by this shining jewel. And she realized that the jewel was the baby in her womb. A friend in Norway says, why should it surprise us that God can speak to pagans in dreams? God speaks to many indigenous peoples all over the world, and many bad-tempered, bullying atheists in their dreams. And God spoke to Hilda's pagan mother in a dream. So Hilda was born in exile But before long, while she was still a young girl, her uncle Edwin regained the throne of Deira with its headquarters at York. And while fleeing, before he regained the throne, he'd stayed with Celtic, nominally Christian people and kings and had learned something about Christ. But he was still a pagan. But now he was back as king. He wanted to take as his wife Princess Ethelberga of Kent, who had become a Christian through the mission sent by the Pope, who sent Bishop Paulinus to be a chaplain to the Kent king. And they had become Christians in the Roman tradition. And Ethelberga's father agreed that she could become the queen of Hilda's uncle, Edwin, on condition that Edwin seriously considered accepting the faith. His main headquarters was at York. He did accept the faith after somebody tried to assassinate him. And on Easter Day, though the Welsh sources say it was at Pentecost, he and all his large household of relatives, courtiers and so on, were baptized at York. Celtic as well as Roman bishops were present. Bishop Paulinus, who'd come from Rome, was sent across Edwin's kingdom and made many converts. Bede says that the rivers were overflowing like the River Jordan, with the people being baptized. However, Edwin was killed by a usurping king. Paulinus fled back to Kent. And the people returned to their pagan gods because they said, oh, well, if this Christian God doesn't save the king's life, he can't be much good. We'll go back to our pagan gods. So there had been a firework display of Christianity. But the fire quickly went out. Novels picture Hilda in exile, so she had to go into exile too. We don't know where. Some novels picture her coming north to the border of modern-day Scotland. I think that's most unlikely. I think it's most likely that she went down to East Anglia. Why? Because her sister Herreswith married the son of East Anglia's Christian king, King Redwold, devout Christian, and his father before him had been, and his son was King Anna, who was a devout Christian. And so I think Hilda stayed there with her family and lived a life of prayer. They lived quite near to Etheldreda, who went back to Ely after coming up here. And it's quite possible that Hilda was a spiritual foster mother to the girl Etheldreda, who was a cousin. And Oswald replaced the king, who was the enemy to Hilda's people. Although Oswald was not a relative of Hilda's lot, he was hospitable, humble, magnanimous. And it seems to me likely that he invited back all the old royals and the old people who'd known Bamborough to maybe a banquet at Easter, for example. One way or another, we know that Hilda met Aidan, though we don't know when or how. And the question is, and we know that she was very transformed by her meeting with Aidan. What did she find when she met Aidan? She probably visited Lindisfarne. The first thing to strike her was probably the different lifestyle. Paulinus dressed as a dignitary and spent donors' money on ornate church buildings. Aidan dressed in the simple woolen clothes of ordinary people and gave donations that rich people gave him to the poor, refusing to use them as bribes to favour them. He even refused to ride a horse, for that would have put him above the poor, who could not afford horses. That's the first thing I think Hilda would have noticed when she met Aidan. A second contrast was their different approaches to mission. Under Edwin, Hilda's uncle, people were commanded to come to the royal centres and listen to one man, Paulinus, in his foreign language. Aidan, in contrast, walked with his brothers in the places where the people lived, in their poor cottages and farms, far from the royal centres. Often they would ask their new friends to tell them their own stories and beliefs. The ordinary people were listened to by Aidan's missionaries. They were talked down to by Paulinus. Perhaps a third thing that Hilda noticed was what we might call interfaith dialogue today. The brothers were invited into their homes, and they were probably smelly, some of them, and people were washing, cooking meals, and they invited the brothers to pray for them, to tell them stories, play with the children perhaps. And such was the welcome that the poor in their cottages gave to Aidan and his brothers, that the faith took root at a grassroots level in the homes. And 50 years later, B told us, when Hilda was still alive, when anyone met someone from Lindisfarne, they ran to him, eagerly asking him to give them a blessing or a word for them. And Aidan's teaching won the hearts of everyone because he and his followers lived what they taught. So Hilda saw authenticity here. Perhaps a third difference she found when she met Aidan and all his lot here was their model of the church. Paulinus thought that the way to spread the gospel was to make the church the most prestigious institution in the world. Bigger buildings, more important dressed up clergy who were dignitaries, huge libraries and so on. Aidan thought that in telling the message they had to model the kingdom of God, to establish little communities, colonies of heaven that were villages of God for all people of all backgrounds. He built his churches of wood. If people no longer wanted a church, they died away. They weren't a problem, like the poor state churches of today have, keeping them going when nobody else uses them. And they had wooden huts for the monks, the workers, the guests, the students. The Roman Christians looked down on all this as primitive, simple, provincial. Wasn't like Rome. Then Aidan was given rich donations by rich people. He gave it all away to the poor, or he went to the slave market and bought their freedom from slavery, and then he could likely as not offered them a job in a monastery, cooking, or if they were academic, learning. And so the Celtic mission saw everybody as a child of God with a huge calling. You didn't have to be a university type. There was a fourth difference that Hilda must have noticed between the Roman and the Irish styles. The Christianity that Paulinus introduced was an indoors religion. They commanded the people working in the fields to leave them behind and come to a royal centre. God was in the ornate royal centre or church building. But Aidan said, God is in creation. He's where you live, in your farms. You can see him in the trees and the flowers and the plants, and the animals, if you're truly quiet, will come to you. He taught his flock to fast and pray for 40 days, to heal the very land itself. The elements for the Irish Christians were expressions of God through which he could speak to them. And the fifth difference that Hilda noticed when she met Aidan was that the Irish had the soul friend, the Anam Cara, the spiritual foster mother. And they taught that a person, an ordinary person, a person who's very poor, in an ordinary farm cottage, with a person without a soul friend is like a person without a head. So everybody could have a soul friend. And perhaps a last difference, which is more intangible, that Hilda saw between Aidan's mission and the Roman was this. The Irish taught, and Aidan taught, give them the milk, like a mother's milk coming from her breast into her baby. That wasn't the Roman approach. The Roman approach was you impose something which is much more important, and so people are kind of browbeaten into accepting it. And if they want to get on in life and be good people with the king and so on, they accept this on their ways, their terms. Aidan said no, nurture them with a mother's milk of kindness. And I think the kindness must have impacted Hilda. Well, however often they met, we know that she was profoundly impacted by the spirituality of Aidan, and yet she was not Irish, and yet she had to go back into exile. And she returned to East Anglia. And that could have been the last we heard of Hilda, because the time came when her sister, who'd married a prince and her husband died, her sister decided that she wanted to be a nun in a place of safety where there were all the facilities and she could have education, spiritual rhythms, hospitality. And so she decided to go to one of the double monasteries for men and women established in France, Francia as they called it. And they'd started there because the Irish monk Columbanus had gone through what is now France and other countries of Europe and founded many monasteries for men. And unlike the Roman tradition, which a lot of the bishops were, they were down to earth, grassroots, human. Everybody was authentic. They had a tough spirituality, a tough regime of prayer. They worked the land, but they were places of friendship with the people around, and they were very, very fruitful places. And people wanted to join them, so they were very popular and they grew fast. They were grassroots monasticism. But the noble women, the wives of the leading strata of society, said, why should this only be for men? Why can't we have them for women? And so they, the Frankish noble women, started monasteries for women. And some of them were for women and men, and some of them were just for women. And they were greatly blessed. And Hilda and her sister knew about them and said, there are killing fields all through the Saxon kingdoms. One person kills another king, and the endless bloodshed, and the men go to war and they bring back the heads on their spears and put them outside the tent, and their women folk have to, like slave labour, they have to bring up the children and do the cooking, and they have no education. So let's emigrate. Well, one day Aidan heard that Hilda intended to emigrate from East Anglia to France. And I think this was one of the biggest and most shattering moments of his life. I think that it made him realise that deep in his heart he had always longed that the Irish spiritual foster mothers and monasteries like Bridget's, which had men and women in Ireland, could spread through England, and he'd only achieved half of it. He'd only got monasteries for male boys. It was all male. And he suddenly realised that only women could reach parts of the Saxon psyche that nobody else could reach. And he longed to have nuns, and he'd have one or two like Bigo, but it was a very tiny thing. And he suddenly realised that if Hilda went, the woman who could change everything would be lost. And he'd go back, or he'd die, having only half accomplished what God had put on his heart. I mean, this is my intuition, imagining what Aidan was thinking. What we do know is that he sent a message which was not his kingdom. It was outside his kingdom, to Hilda down in East Anglia. And he said, as many years later Lord Kitchener used to say in Britain, there's a poster saying, your country needs you, and a finger pointing at you. Your country needs you. And he sent a message to Hilda saying, your country needs you. Please come and help us to develop women's monasteries. Hilda must have been shattered. She was set to go to France. All this peace, all this women's liberation. And here was Aidan saying, come back into this ghastly mess. People are always fighting, and men abuse women. Maybe she'd had a husband or even two husbands, and they'd been killed on the battlefield. B did not know, because he always called anybody who was celibate a virgin. But he didn't call Hilda a virgin, which makes some people think he either didn't know whether she'd be married or he didn't want to mention it, because marriage was second rate in his eyes. But I think she had been married, probably, for that reason. Anyway, she, in the end, comes. But she says to Aidan, who will train me? They've got people trained in the monastic life in France. Who will train me? And Aidan said, oh, we Irish will train you. Me and my soul friends. Now, the Romans wouldn't allow men to be alone with women. That was unthinkable. But Aidan, and there was much more free and easy flow between men and women in Ireland. So Aidan said, we'll visit you regularly, and we'll have soul friends, and so on and so on, and we'll answer your questions. Don't worry. And so that process went on. And then Aidan said to her, I want you to start a little group down at a place near the River Wear. Some people think it's the place that is now the big monastery at Jarrow, which became a men's monastery later and started as a women's thing. Others mention that there's a little place called Stowe, which used to be called Women at Stowe, and nobody's ever known why it should have been called Women at Stowe. So they think, was that the place where Hilda had a group of women? Anyway, these women multiplied, more and more and more came, and they knitted, and they had gardens and herb gardens and made meals, and they brought all the babies in and they washed them and taught mothers how to look after babies, and it just went like wildfire. So much so that after about barely a year, Aidan said to Hild, you're needed at another place. Now we mentioned that Bigu went to a little few cells at Hart's Pool on the Hartlepool headland. This had grown, and Aidan said to Hilda, right, take this monastery and let it grow and extend. And she established a rule of life there. Bede says it had justice, purity, and something else. Simplicity, was it? But he doesn't go into the details. They didn't have written rules of life, as far as we know, at this stage. The founder was the rule, and he modelled it and talked to people week by week, so they got an idea of the rhythm of prayer and how they should treat visitors and all that sort of thing. But Hilda built up Hartlepool into a large monastery, and you can go to Hartlepool Headland, and they've done quite a bit of archaeological research. They probably found one of Hilda's companions, the headstones there. And if you go to St Hilda's Church on Hartlepool Headland, they're open, hopefully again after COVID, every Saturday and every Wednesday. And the ladies of the church will make you cups of tea, and you have a wonderful audio-visual presentation of Hilda and the monastery as they re-visit it there. Well, Aidan died in 651, so it must have been sad for Hilda. And Oswald, of course, had died also before then, and Hilda was at Hartlepool, and then Oswy came to the throne, the nominal Christian, and his wife, in the Roman tradition, as I said the other day, pressurized him to tell God that if he won the battle against the big pagan invader, he would make available 12 plots of land for big new monasteries, and that they were to dedicate their little one-year-old girl Elfrida to be brought up as a virgin nun for the rest of her life by a spiritual foster mother. Well, they won the battle, and they turned to Hilda because she was a fellow royal. She knew them, and so they said to Hilda, take Elfrida, and she forever after was with Hilda from the age of 1 until she was a grown adult. That was quite a big undertaking in itself. But then they said to Hilda, go to a place we call Whitby, they call Straniauch, is it in the original language. And it had been a big Roman port with a big beacon because it was an important seafaring place for the boats in Roman times, and still was. And either there was an old monastery that had fallen into disrepair, or that she was asked to start an entirely new monastery on that site. It became the largest double monastery for men and women in Britain. And archaeologists have discovered some of the men's quarters, some of the women's quarters, but they shared together in the worship, in the church, and in some of the education. And it grew and grew and grew. We know that 5, or 6 actually, but one of them died, of the students of Hilda became eminent bishops who were famed for their healing. So they went out to people who were ill and prayed for them. They had a healing ministry. We know that Hilda's method was what we might call a sandwich course today. In the morning they were with their books, learning the Latin of the Gospels and so on and so on. In the afternoon they were sent out into the villages to learn how to do what Aidan had done, to store the faith, to tell the stories, to befriend the local villagers, and eventually to be invited to their homes. And they established big crosses in the centre of the village, and eventually that one of them would come on a Sunday and have worship and teach them stories and so on. And so this was the double way of teaching there, which they do theological students today. Some of them haven't attempted it. So half of it is academic training and half of it is on-the-job, people-centred training. So you're always people-centred. This is so important. But Hilda, there are many other stories of Hilda, and one of them is about, so they grew more and more farms. It became a very, very large area. And the farms provided them with food, and the poor with food. And one of the cowherds, called Cadman, looked after the cows, And one of the things they did was to have a karaoke, as I call it, without the machinery. They would gather in a large barn with a lovely fire and take it in turn to pass a harp round, and everybody would play the harp or sing a song or tell a rhyme or something like that. Now Cadman was very shy. He wasn't taught anything. He felt inferior, and he was frightened of having his turn at the karaoke. So he slipped out unseen and went back to his little shed where he slept, or hut where he slept the night, looking after his cows. And there he dreamed. And in the dream a radiant young man came to him, angel, whatever, and said to him, "Sing me something, Cadman." And Cadman said, "I've just slipped out of the karaoke. I couldn't dare sing there." And he said, "No, don't worry about them. Sing it to me." And Cadman liked this radiant young man, and he found himself singing a wonderful song about God creating the world. And when he woke up, he could remember the dream, he could remember the song, the words, and he could remember the tune. And he told his manager. So they see that shows you had managers who were human and loving and caring, and you could talk like that too. His manager was so impressed, he thought he had a gift other than looking after cows. And he got a message to Mother Hilda, who was very, very busy. She was the principal of the biggest theological college, the administrator of the biggest monastic estate, and half the world came to have spiritual direction. She was extremely busy, but he got the message to Hilda, and she took it seriously. She asked Cadman to come up, and she said, "Sing us a song." And then she said to one of her teachers, "Teach him a Bible story and ask him to go back to this hut and see if he can compose a song about the Bible story." And then the next day he came back up, sang the song up in the monastery, and then he had another Bible story and remembered it and sang the song. She said, "God has given you a special gift, so you must come into the monastery, but it would ruin you if you became like all these academic types who are becoming priests. No, God wants you to be a lay brother." But he became the first pop singer in the English language, or to use a more highfalutin term used by people in the past, he became the father of English poetry. Now this, John Wesley once said, "I care not who makes the laws of a country so long as God has the songs of a country." Well now, neither Aidan nor Hilda had quite got onto that. God had got onto it. And Cadman became the first Bible pop singer of the English people. And the songs went all around places where outside the monasteries where only people who could do A-levels, as it were, could go. And I think it's a wonderful thing. And so in the community of Aidan and Hilda, we've made a thing of this and say, Hilda calls us to release the song in every human heart. I was with a group of students run by the Methodist Church in Texas. Quite a small church, they only have 3,000 members, unlike the 20,000 member beggar churches all around them. But anyway, I had this afternoon with students, and they were playing football. Only one of them was a black American, and he was slightly overweight and not all that brilliant at football. And he left, I noticed, before the others had finished playing and went home or went somewhere. But then he came back. Oh, and I said to him, "What are you studying?" He said, "Music." And I told him the story of Cadman. I said, your calling could be to release a song in every human heart. But anyway, he left and went back. But he came back about an hour later, and he said, "Excuse me, could you repeat what you said to me an hour ago?" And I said, "Yes, God might be calling you to release a song in every human heart." And he said, "Thank you very much," and left. So this is part of the Aidan and Hilda DNA, to release a song in every human heart. And we thank Hilda for it. And if you go to Whitby, you can climb up Cadman's Trod, isn't it? Called Cadman's Trod, up the steps to the allotments. And I'm praying that somebody keep it quiet. Somebody in Whitby will have an allotment and put up a little hut called Cadden's Hut and start singing songs there. Anyway, she also, as well as having all these wonderful people who had healing ministries, she was asked by King Oswy to host the Synod of Whitby, which was the biggest ecclesiastical event in the history of Christianity in Britain up to that point. And the point of the Synod of Whitby was really whether it was about whether Britain should be in the European Union, so to speak, whether the Saxon kingdoms could have alliances with people in other countries which would give them better trade, better clout, better prestige, so and so and so on. I think that's what it was all about, but maybe I'm wrong. So they had followed, Oswy was now following the Roman tradition for the date of Easter because he got a Roman wife. And she was saying, stop all these Irish people who follow Aidan having Easter at a different date. Stop them having this ridiculous tonsure with long hair at the back. We've got to be like everybody else in the Christian world. Monks should just have their hair shaved off all round. Stop them baptising people in a different way to we do in the Roman tradition. Stop them, all this stuff that goes on at Lindisfarne. We don't want all this. But so he summoned a synod and had a bishop from Agilbert from overseas, from France. Wilfrid was there, the Putin of the church, and Ced was there translating. Possibly Cuthbert was there, we don't know. Anyway, all the lot from Lindisfarne came, and the synod decided to impose the Roman rules, and all the Irish left heartbroken. And Hilda was the hostess. Now, obviously, she'd been asked to be the hostess because it was the largest venue in the kingdom, because she was the most able. She was like Faith, you see, she could manage lots of different properties without it all falling to bits. And you can imagine her, she had to welcome Bishop Wilfrid, and Wilfrid would want splendour in his accommodation. He'd say, I've got to have a kettle, I've got to have this, I've got to have all this. They had to deal with people like that, and then they had to deal, and Bede tells us, the people who came from Lindisfarne, Bishop Feenan, they didn't want anything. They said, we just have a simple place, we just drink water. And they needn't worry about us. They weren't fussy. So they weren't a problem for Hilda. But she treated them all equally, with equal hospitality. And this is a very important thing about Hilda. So she must have been very, very disappointed. She voted with the Irish, for the Irish rule, but she accepted that the new regulations were the framework under which she would work for the rest of her life, as did Cuthbert. She must have been heartbroken that the Irish went back to Ireland. She must have been heartbroken that 30 of the Saxons left Lindisfarne to go back to Ireland. But she at Whitby stayed firmly in her post, utterly loyal, and she had people from Roman tradition coming to her as a spiritual mother, but she had people who still wanted to follow the Irish tradition and remain here, coming to her as a spiritual mother. She was not a pushover. Wilfrid wanted to sack one of her students who became a bishop, and Wilfrid persuaded the Pope to get rid of him, and she stood for justice. And so, although she was now quite ill, she sent a personal representative to the Pope to put the case for standing by this man who had done nothing whatever wrong, was doing a perfectly good job, but Wilfrid wanted rid of him because he wasn't of the Roman persuasion. The Pope, unfortunately, was not persuaded, and so Hilda lost the case, and Wilfrid won. But, so Wilfrid was this power monger, the Putin of the church, but his biographer says that even Wilfrid related to Hilda, called her merciful mother. And everybody related to her because she had a heart of mercy, and she had no, she had no fear or favour, no favouritism. She was not prejudiced. She was. This freedom from prejudice is so very important. And I think that she straddled the division between the Irish and the Roman, kept the essential spirituality of Aidan alive under a framework that she didn't like. And for the last 6 years of her life, she got a terrible illness. People speculate what it was. And I've forgotten what they speculate. Anyway, she had a blood and coughing and so on. And she was very bad, but she did not fail night or day to attend the church with her brothers and sisters in the praise of God. So she was very, very strong-willed, absolutely immovable in maintaining that. And in the last year of her life, she founded a daughter monastery, presumably because Whitby was overflowing and couldn't take everybody. It was a village, by the way. It wasn't just a monastery with no other people living around. And if you go to that dreadful English heritage thing at the Abbey on Whitby, which does a total disservice to Hilda and does Dracula well, but they do, if you stay long enough, they put pictures on a screen above in one of the rooms. One of them is the village of Whitby. So there were hundreds of people living all around, going right to the coast, because it was a fishing village. And so, in a way, Whitby was a village of God, with the monastery at its heart. And Hilda, when she died, we told the story yesterday of the people at Hackness seeing her go to heaven. And she went to heaven, and the monastery continued for a short time under Elfrida and others, and there the life of Pope Gregory the Great, who was one of the best popes in the history of all popes, he was a wonderful man. They wrote that there. It was famed for its learning and its library, but it was destroyed by Vikings, so it didn't last long. And for 1,000 years, no women were allowed to do the thing again, because the Roman ways followed, and then the Normans came with their feudal system with men at the top. And if you go to Durham Cathedral, near the entrance is a row of black tiles. No woman was allowed to pass beyond the black tiles when the Normans came, this was. And they told fabricated stories about Cuthbert, that he didn't like women, because they had the Shrine of Cuthbert. And the world came to see Cuthbert, so they had to make up these stories that he was anti-woman, which is total nonsense. And I was invited to go, because I was community of Aidan and Hilda, to Durham Cathedral, whatever it was, 15 years ago. There was a movement called Women and Men in the Church or something, and it was part of the ordination of women. And they wanted to restore women in the church in equality, and they brought a sculptress to bring a beautiful sculpture and an icon of Hilda, dedicate one of the chapels to Hilda in Durham Cathedral. And I was invited to say something about the community of Aidan and Hilda. And on the 1400th anniversary of Hilda's baptism, I was invited to the Anglican Centre in Rome to talk about Hilda as a sign of reconciliation. People from the Vatican were there, Gregorian people, lecturers. And the director said, well, the Anglican Church is split between the Africans, who have the death penalty for homosexuals and won't ordain women, some of them in those days, and the Americans who let anything go, as it were, in their eyes, and they won't have communion together. So the African American bishops refused to have communion. They'd broken into communion. It was splitting the Anglican communion. But the people from the Gregorian University said, oh, it's like that with Rome too. The Pope's called a big congress on the family and wants to change this and the other, but the diehards won't change anything. So I said, well, does anybody listen to women in the Vatican? And a woman who worked in the Vatican said, no, nobody ever listens to women in the Vatican. So I said, well, it's 1,000 years now since Hilda was the leader for both women and men. And I heard that Pope John Paul II had a woman as a muse. He did, and she actually gave him. This muse gave to somebody in Cambridge a copy of my book on Celtic spirituality, and but she was a prophet and a prophetess. She was a muse. So anyway, we talked about how the church can move into a new era where we can again have double monasteries for men and women, and so on, so on, so on. So, and if you go to Whitby, you'll find ammonite, if you look very hard, because most people have pinched them by now, but on the beach there is ammonite. And the legend grew after Hilda's death that she had such spiritual authority she could command a snake to shrivel till it became a bit of ammonite. And so ammonite has become a symbol of Hilda. And so when people take when they take first vows, we have this cross in the Aidan and Hilda community. When you take life vows, should you have something else? Somebody made crosses made of ammonite so that we can take up the eternal struggle of Mother Hilda. And then other people, there's another legend that if you go to Whitby, the birds dip their wings in salute of Hilda. It's a nice legend, but what it tells us is that her spiritual authority lingered in the area long after her death. So there we go, we have Hilda, and if you go to the church, the parish church, on the top of the hill at Hilda, you can see a beautiful homily of St Hilda, which people think she wrote. Well, she didn't, but somebody there in the church wrote it, and it's rather good. We ought to put it on cards and have it in our bedrooms. Trade with the gifts God has given you. Bend your minds to holy learning, that you may escape the fretting moth of littleness of mind that would wear out your souls. Brace your wills to actions, that they may not be the spoils of weak desires. Train your hearts and lips to song which give courage to the soul. Being buffeted by trials, learn to laugh. Being reproved, give thanks. Having failed, determine to succeed. Thank God for Hilda. I'm sorry for gone on.